So welcome and welcome back to those who've been following the series and those who are just joining for the first time. This is our 2021 EqualPayMA Roundtable series brought to you today in partnership with the Office of Economic Empowerment, the Massachusetts Women of Color Coalition, and the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. Today, we'll be talking about LGBTQ+, COVID-19, and economic security. This is our little agenda. We will introduce our panelists, and then we'll hop right into a conversation with our moderator, Rebecca Bacht. And we'll have time for our audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up right at noon. I went backwards instead of forwards. Okay, so quick thank you to our partners, Maywalk and the Math Commission. We will be dropping links to their websites in the chat along with OEE's links. And I keep going backwards. You can join the conversation live today by using the hashtag EqualPayMA, and you can follow us on Twitter at EmpowermentMA, like us on Facebook at Economic Empowerment MA, and then for more information about the Roundtable series, feel free to email us at equalpayma@trade.state.ma.us or visit our website equalpayma.com. And then for those of you, again, following our series, we have one more session in December. We're going to be discussing the future of pay equity for Massachusetts and beyond, December 16th at 11 a.m. This one will be a reactor panel to all of the series in the last year and looking forward to what pay equity looks like in 2022 and forward. Our first panelist that I'll introduce here is Trey-Andre Valentine. He is the executive director of the Mass Trans Political Coalition. I'll give you all a second to look at his bio really quick. We will be also including information about all of our speakers on our socials. Next, we have Grace Moreno. She is the executive director of the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Next, we have Michael R. Galvan, and he is the policy director at Break Time. And we'll be including links to each of these organizations in the chat as well as that follow-up email you should receive. Next, we have Lee Badgett, professor at UMass Amherst. And finally, our moderator for today is Rebecca Bacht. She is a commissioner on the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, as well as an attorney at Robbins Kaplan LLP's Boston office.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Shaitia. I am so excited to be here today. Thank you. Shaitia is my sister commissioner on the Mass Commission on the Status of Women, and I am really excited to be partnering today and also to be participating in shining a light on economic issues facing the LGBTQ community, which I am a part of. And I'm so thrilled with our amazing array of panelists today and the expertise that they bring. So I want to jump right into the substance and hear all about their knowledge. And we're going to start with Lee. Lee, to help us frame today's conversation, could you please share some data about the state of economic security for folks who identify as LGBTQ+?
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important conversation to be having here in Massachusetts. I think we have an enormous quantity of data gathered over the last couple of decades that show that LGBT people are very vulnerable economically, and maybe surprisingly, even here in Massachusetts, which is a place that we think of as being more inclusive than average in the United States, we still see that there are significant challenges that people face economically. We think they come from things like employment discrimination. They might come from overlapping identities, so the intersectionality of identities puts some LGBT people even at more risk. We think that comes from other kinds of challenges that arise in the context of having poor health or having challenges in education. All these things matter. But let me just show you a few data points just to see how this really looks here in Massachusetts. And I apologize, these are a little bit hard to read, but I will kind of tell you what the key highlights are. I mean, we know that there are a lot of LGBT people in Massachusetts. From the Gallup survey, about 5.4% of Massachusetts residents identify as LGBT. Some fairly evenly split, male and female, although a little bit more heavily on the female side. About 1 in 5 LGBT people are raising kids. About 1 in 4 LGBT people are people of color. So we have a very diverse set of LGBT people, and also across the age range. We tend to, just in general, LGBT people tend to be more on the younger side. I think that partly reflects people being more willing to come out on surveys. Looking at the next slide, we can ask, how this really interesting and diverse group of LGBT people experience the economy. And
sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
While we're waiting, I just happen to be very curious. I noticed that the data you were displaying breaks down gender by male and female. Do you know if data is starting to be collected that includes non-binary or other gender identifications outside of male and female?
Definitely, that's being talked about quite a bit, and I think that's a much longer conversation we could have, but it's challenging to know exactly how to do that, but people are thinking very hard about that. And some surveys are starting to try that out in different kinds of ways. Going back to the socioeconomic indicators. So if you see all those little comparisons on the left side of the screen here, what that's telling us is up at the top, the darker blue bars darker blue points are where LGBT people are. The one right below it is where non-LGBT people are in Massachusetts. We're about equally likely to be unemployed and uninsured, which before COVID, things look relatively good. And yet, when we drill down and start looking at indicators of economic insecurity, we see it's very clear. So for food insecurity, for example, 20% of LGBT people on that survey reported some form of food insecurity, compared to only 12% of LGBT people. That very bottom line there, we see the income levels that get reported to Gallup show us who has a very low income, a household income of $24,000 or less. And again, about 1 in 5, 21% of LGBT people are in that lowest level, compared with only 15% of non-LGBT people. And this is surprising in some ways because we know that LGBT people have the same educational attainment, which we see on the right-hand side overall in Massachusetts, but they are not having the same economic experiences. And the next slide will show us what happens when we look more specifically at more standard measures of poverty for Massachusetts. On the left-hand side, we can see that regardless of race and ethnicity, that LGBT people are more likely to be poor. So if we look at white people, 9% of LGBT white people are poor, living below the poverty lines, which are very low, compared to only 5% of white people in Massachusetts. For people of color, all people of color have higher economic vulnerability measured here, but LGBT people who are people of color are a little bit worse off than non-LGBT people of color. And we're very slowly starting to be able to look more at gender identity in different measures. So not so much the non-binary side, but for looking at people who identify as transgender. We have a survey that's done across the country, but it's also done here in Massachusetts, the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System data. And we can identify transgender people. There weren't a lot in the years that we combined, but it gives us a pretty clear picture of showing that transgender people in particular are economically vulnerable. So almost 1 in 4 have incomes below the poverty line for their families, which is in line to a certain extent with cisgender women, but cisgender men have much lower rates of poverty. So if we took all cisgender people and averaged them, transgender people would have much higher rates of poverty. So the last thing I'll just say is just to reinforce the idea, this is all pre-COVID. We went into the pandemic in a situation of economic vulnerability. And so it is not surprising that with the national data we have, I don't have Massachusetts data, but with the national data we have, that LGBT people were hit really hard and were hit much harder. They were more likely to lose jobs. They were more likely to report food insecurity. They were more likely to lose hours at work and that sort of thing. So just on many different kinds of indicators in the COVID era, that bad position we were in beforehand has really hit us very hard. So I know that's not great news to end with, but that is the way it is. Sometimes these data are important to just kind of assess in a head-on kind of way.
No, it's really helpful to understand where we are so that we can do the work that we need to do. So thank you so much for sharing that information with us. And folks in the audience, if you have questions, we'll be hoping to take your questions at the end. So if you have questions for Lee, you can pop them in the Q&A box on Zoom. And Shaitia, please help me for the folks on Facebook. I'm not sure how that works actually for questions. But I would love to move on to Michael, who can share with us perhaps some insight as to why members of the LGBTQ plus community are disproportionately represented among the unhoused and those experiencing poverty. So Michael, could you please let us know your insights on those topics?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Rebecca. So I think the narrative here is really, unfortunately, very straightforward and very simple. As young people are coming out, they are facing struggles with families who may not necessarily be accepting of their identity or their expression of that identity itself, and so are being estranged from their families as that process occurs. Lee just did a really great job overviewing socioeconomic data for the LGBTQ plus community, and I wanted to add to it that survey data consistently finds in the Massachusetts youth count that anywhere from 30 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness in Massachusetts in a given year identify as LGBTQ plus. So there's an overrepresentation of the queer community in the homeless population in Massachusetts as a whole. And to extrapolate that data a little bit more, there's data that's reported from Measure of America that shows that there's 56,000 young adults in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that are struggling as a direct result of COVID to find opportunities to access employment. And if we know that 30 to 40% of them are struggling, are there because of their gender identity, sexual orientation, or expression, we are looking at a vast outweighing number of young adults who are really being put into really difficult situations because of their expression and their identity itself.
Wow, that's disheartening to hear, but again, good to ground ourselves in the current reality so we can do the work. And speaking of doing the work, can you please tell us a bit about your organization, Break Time, the work that you're doing to support homeless youth in Boston, and some of the success in your housing match program as it relates to LGBTQ participants and their efforts to secure housing and achieve more economic mobility?
Absolutely. So Break Time, again, has an overrepresentation of LGBTQ individuals who are coming to our program. What our program specifically does is it works with young adults experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity to find them opportunities for year-round employment subsidized at the city's living wage, Boston's living city wage of $16 an hour. So we pair these young adults up in local nonprofits, small Black and LGBTQ-owned businesses that are struggling to find hires, and they get hands-on workforce experience while, again, earning a living wage. Additionally to that, we provide them with a match savings program. So dollar for dollar, we match up to $50 a week. So young adults can graduate the program with about $1,300 in their savings account. And we also provide them with a year of credit counseling because I remember being 20, 21, 22, not having any idea what credit is and how it affects my life, and then not knowing how to go about actually sustaining and getting good credit. And so we work with young adults to ensure that they are able to not only learn what credit is, but get a positive credit score that will successfully improve their outcomes for long-term employment, long-term housing, and other key things that are dependent upon credit scores itself. And so, you know, we are really diligently working to ensure that young adults are set up with the long-term successes on the economic side of things by working with housing partners, because we believe in a housing first model to ensure that not only are young adults getting access to the housing supports and services they need, but they are able to make the fiscal and economic long-term impacts to their lives that will ensure their success going forward.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. I'm so happy to hear about this amazing program and all the ways that, you know, you're really delving into, you know, not just the direct issue of housing, but also, you know, the long-term related issues that can be addressed. And I think it's awesome. So thank you so much for sharing that. I want to turn to Treyandre and ask some questions there. So Treyandre, according to the MTPC, the Mass Trans Political Coalition Community Needs Assessment in 2019, your respondents' top concerns included employment and housing. In terms of safety, the respondents reported public harassment as their top concern. They also identified workplace harassment to be a huge concern. In what ways can workplaces encourage a safe and inclusive environment, from the hiring process to the day-to-day work culture, ways that go beyond a one-time or infrequent seminar on diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I'm asking you a lot of stuff, so maybe we'll stop there and I can continue with the questions after you address that.
Yes.
So how can we address having a safe and inclusive environment in the workplace?
Well, I think one of the things that is pretty sort of simple but can go a long way is using people's correct pronouns, right? That's one of the most basic ways someone can respect someone's identity. And also, I think being mispronounced and misgendered happens to trans people all the time in sort of like many aspects throughout their day. And so if the workplace can be that one place that they don't get misgendered or mispronounced, that goes really far. Also, too, people are, you know, for whatever reasons, people are very curious about trans people's bodies. I think not asking questions about an individual's plans to have any sort of like medical surgical procedures. Also, too, I think just having a culture of where you're able to talk about gender identity and the ways in which transphobia and cis heteronormativity actually show up in the workplace. So being able to have those conversations with it without there being sort of like negative consequences. Because very often what happens is I've found that trans people bring up things at the office, right, in their workplace, and where they may be experiencing microaggressions, and very often that ends up leading them to be getting fired. And so there needs to be a way to safely talk about having a culture that is not only one of welcoming, but also inclusion and belonging that does not result in retaliation.
Please continue.
No, I can stop. I can stop there.
I don't need you to stop. I was just going to say everything you're saying resonates so much. We're doing a lot of sort of work in my workplace, trying to figure out how to be more inclusive and welcoming to trans folk who work in our offices now or may in the future, and doing a lot of this preparation and working on our culture is so important. But I also hear that there are workplaces out there where there can be negative consequences for trans folk just existing, and that is something that needs to change. So thank you for raising those issues. And I agree with you that using correct name and pronoun is such a big important step. And I am really heartened that seems to be making steps forward in becoming more normalized as something we all do. So and it should be, it's very basic.
Yes.
So
I would
go
Can I
ahead.
just also add one more thing, which is I think there are also very well-intentioned employers out there who really, they want to do the right thing. They want to hire trans people, right? But it's really a matter of, are you prepared? Are you fully prepared to support a trans person in the workplace? Because that could look very different, especially if we're thinking about trans people and non-binary people who, out of the LGBT communities, experience some of are the most disenfranchised, right? And oftentimes may end up having to resort to survival or street economy. And then switching from doing that into going into an office, to being with, co-workers, to maybe having, responsibilities as supervisor, there needs to be support along the way for that. And so not only about hiring a trans person, but making sure there's the support and development for them in their career.
This is a great segue into the next question that I had for you, which is what kinds of trans focused professional development opportunities should employers include in order to ensure equitable progress for trans folk in their place of work? So I'm not sure if that's that the support, the provision of that support is what you were talking about, but if you have any more to add about, what employers should be looking to do for their trans employees, please shout it out.
Absolutely. So in terms of what employers can do to sort of ensure an equitable progress, I think it's not just not just hire a trans person, right? But ensure that there's also a movement for growth, right? Opportunities for growth, providing some sort of I think coaching or a support, not coaching, but making sure that there's opportunities for further trainings, for further sort of professional development. If you want to move from going from a coordinator to a manager to a director, making sure that there are things in place, the support pieces in place, like trainings, it's really about just investing in the development of someone. And so I think that will go a long way. It's not just hiring a trans person, but making sure that there is movement for growth, helping to I think also develop wealth as well. That is something that I don't think a trans person trans people don't really think about, because they're so much on the level of just surviving. I'm trying to think if what else I can bring up here.
No, I appreciate everything you said, and please continue to share as you think of things. I think something you said earlier about retaliation. I think if I'm imagining if we want to retain and develop our trans employees, that something employers can do is certainly have well-developed policies to not tolerate harassment and microaggressions and a culture that harms trans folks. So I think that there's so much to do to affirmatively develop the career of trans employees, but there's also work to be done with cis employees to the extent that they are not contributing to a culture of welcoming and inclusiveness of trans employees, to make sure that the trans employees are permitted to thrive. So,
Absolutely.
you know, I hope for both sides of the coin there. So, yeah. So, do you want to share anything more, or shall I just
Yes, I mean, you
go
did
for it?
mention bringing up, you mentioned policies, and I think that is absolutely important, right? Because that's, we sort of like, it's almost like the policies sort of like laid that foundation in terms of the expectation and culture as well. But it's not just having I think the policies are great. It's also making sure that folks know what those policies are. And also, if there is any violation, what is the next step? How do they actually get addressed? I don't think people actually know what that looks like if in their companies, in their organizations. Very often when I talk to employers, they people at their workplace, they really don't know what their policies say, and they really don't know if something happens, what is the protocol. So I think making sure that that is very transparent as well. But also, policies only go so far. There does need to be, again, it's that implementation, it's that building of culture within your workplace that we really need to look at.
Totally agree. A multi-pronged strategy that, policy and practice. So thank you so much, Treyandre. Again, folks, if you have questions for the panelists, pop them in the Q&A and we'll hope to return to them later in the program. Turning to Grace, I would like to hear you share some of the success that the Chamber has seen in helping ally corporate and business leaders to be more inclusive and supportive of LGBTQ+ employees and potential employees. So let me know about those.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Treyandre. It's great to jump in after you, and Michael as well, the work that you're doing, that you're both doing in your organizations, and the good Professor Badgett for keeping all of the data together here as we move along. I'm the executive director of the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber, and we have been around for 4 years. Our goal and our mission is to change the way that the relationship is between the corporate sector and the small business sector of LGBTQ people. I'm a firm believer that there is no justice until there's financial justice. So we can't change anything in people's actual lives until people have equity to be able to have an income and a financial security that the rest of us, the rest of community can experience just by who they are and walk in the world. And we see that in the wealth gap between white people and people of color. We see that in the wealth gap between men and women. When you start going further down the line, when you look at people of color that are LGBTQ in various stages of that, then you're like, if you're gay in color, you're better than gay, than lesbian of color, and you're way better than trans of color. And so there's the pecking order keeps going down to where you're the most despaired. I think that what our chamber has done very well, and we've been very grateful for, is originally we started thinking we would just support the small businesses. How would we support small businesses to thrive? What we quickly learned was that the corporate sector is very interested in learning how to be more inclusive. When I first got into the work, I thought, oh, there's been a coming to Jesus in the world. People are talking about inclusion for LGBT community. What I quickly found out is that that's not necessarily so. What is happening is that the workforce that's coming out into society right now is more and more increasingly LGBTQ, non-gender, fluid gendered, trans, non-binary, And corporations had to get savvy because they were losing talent to the corporations that were already savvier. Now, when we talk about savvier, I'm right there with Treande that you can't just slap a bunch of policies together and not implement them. And I think that what we've been trying to do with corporations is help you with your policies. First of all, come to us with where you are. And I have had companies come say, you know what, we've been around for 10 years. We've grown to be a global company and we haven't done anything. We haven't done anything on LGBTQ inclusion, so help us, right? So you start off with, okay, what are the cultural norms of your organization? What are those values that you hold, right? And how do those values include not just people of color, but also the LGBTQ community? And so they have to go through a process of understanding those. And then, there is the hiring of LGBTQ people, but you can't really do that until you have a place where people are going to thrive, right? If you bring in a trans person into a work environment, first of all, many trans people are already, as Treande explained, coming from very disparate environments. They've already suffered tremendously. I mean, I think one of the things that even us in the LGBTQ community that are not trans, don't realize is that most trans people step out into the world in fear of their lives. Okay? Before they get into anything else, they're in fear of their lives because of the great transphobia that's out there, in fear of their lives in front of the police, in front of their lives in fear of peers, sometimes our own race, sometimes our own families. Okay? So that's A1. So when you're walking around with that kind of weight, and you enter a workforce, you have to make sure that in a corporation, let's say Vertex or State Street or anywhere, right? You already walk in kind of ready to like, okay, where are the hits going to come from, right? So it's the organization's responsibility to make sure that that person gets extra protection as they enter into that space, right? And a lot of that is policies, but it's also very important in ally training and ally teaching, because you're going to have three groups of people. You're going to have the folks that are, and these are mostly the young people, because younger people today are way more accepting and understanding of the LGBTQ, non-binary, trans community in a very weird way, and in a very clear way. My kids who are 10 and 8 correct me all the time about making assumptions about somebody's gender, right? We got a puppy and they're like, well, how do we know that she's a she? And I'm like, okay, guys, so it's sort of, this is fluid for them. For those of us, dinosaurs, right? We're still trying to get with the program on the various pieces. And I thank my young staff that keeps me up to date with some of these pieces, right? And it's changing. But if you're not training, there's three pieces. There's the people in the know. Then there's the allies, the ones who say they're in the know or want to be in the know, but they're the biggest offenders sometimes because they think they have it figured out. And then they ask you, well, who's the real mom of a 2-mom family? Well, Jesus Christ, like I am as real a mom as my wife, even though she gave birth, right? Like that's a dumb question. Don't ask who the real mom is. Or, if you're a trans person, oh, well, as Treande was, well, have you had X surgery? That's not your business. Why is that even coming up as a conversation? So training the allies really around how to be good allies and how to, and then building an environment where you can ask some of those questions, but that is done in a safe space where people can actually maybe not even ask it directly of the person, but have there be some education that comes out to staff. And, and I think the success we've had is that we've been able to go to the corporate sector and say, we will help with any of these pieces, right? We have a cadre of educational seminars that we do around pronouns, around sex neutral bathrooms, around intersectionality of LGBTQ people within all that we represent, right? Around what does it mean to be a supportive ally, right? What does that look like? And then what is the evolution of a corporation to get to inclusion? What we're learning is that most corporations aren't even all the way inclusive of Black and Brown people, right? That they're not represented in the boards, they're not represented in the C-suites, they're not partners at the law firms, right? And so when you bring up LGBTQ, we're lagging way behind even that. Okay, so when we go and look for an LGBTQ person on a board to come and advise our board, there's not many out there, right? Because, so when people say, well, why don't you have people on your board? I'm like, why aren't you hiring and promoting them, right? So our chamber sets up 3 job fairs a year. The first one's a trans job fair. It happens every January at the end of the month in partnership with the Trans Club of New England. And what we do before that is we have a big training with our corporate partners to say, are you ready to come to this job fair? Do you understand pronouns? Do you understand you can't ask people their legal name from their resumes to the name they're presenting and how to navigate that piece, right? We have that training in place. But then more importantly, you can't come to the job fair unless you have some very basic pieces in place, right? What kind of health insurance do you offer? Does it cover this kind of place? What kind of safety do you offer for people? All LGBTQ people, right? So we're making strides with our corporate partners. And I think as an organization, one of the things that we've been able to do and have successfully done is if the corporations that join us aren't at least honest to say, you know what, we haven't done anything. We need help the whole way around. Okay, join us. But here's the list of stuff that you have to agree to be a part of. And we have to see an effort that you're there. We have had companies say, we just want to join, but we really don't want to do all that. We kind of just want to say, we're inclusive. And to those people, I say, we don't want your money, because while we need the corporate support financially to run our organization, the impact is really on what those companies do internally. And so the ones that are being left out because we won't accept them because they're not willing to commit to a certain level of standards are getting with the program because they don't want to be left out. If every pharmaceutical is our member and 2 pharmaceuticals are not because they haven't followed through, they're going to get with the program just to be included, right? So I'll stop there just to say that I think, really holding the corporate sector accountable is something that we can do right now because of the challenge that they have on workforce. And I think it's time for us to bring that up. Some of the stats, and Lee might have a better understanding of this, but some of the projections of how people will identify when they graduate from college in the next 10 or 20 years, the percentages are already twice as high as they were 5 years ago, and they're going to be twice as high 5 years from now. And at some point, they're going to get to 30 or 40% of people graduating saying, I don't even think about that, just like my kids say to me, right? I asked my niece recently, who was dating a guy and then was dating a girl, hey, are you gay? She said, Thea, that's such an 80s question, because it was an 80s question. Like, you don't ask that anymore. So how do we older people get with the program? And how do we learn from the young generation who's been so inclusive? And how do we build policy-driven companies that are actually holding themselves accountable to some level of data about how they're going to run their organization?
Well, thank you so much for all of that information and all the work that you're doing to help companies become more inclusive and educated. Have you seen changes both in terms of the needs of LGBT-owned businesses and the corporations that you are helping get on board during the pandemic? Have needs changed or interests changed in terms of how companies are relating to the LGBTQ community as to COVID?
I mean, I think I think the impact of COVID is still to be seen, right? We have been able to help our small businesses stay afloat through, sort of all sorts of methods, right? And the corporate sector kind of stopped doing any social service stuff the first 9 months to a year, just trying to get their corporations to get together, right? How do we get 10,000 employees to work from home on, security driven information that, can't be leaked or hatched or, how do you do that? So they kind of, it was a good timing because while the corporations were doing that, we were helping the small businesses. One of the things that came up for me, and I'm a person of color, I'm an immigrant, I hold very different, many identities, is when it came time to start dispersing funds, whether it be state programs or grants or foundations, immediately, and I thought because of the Floyd, what happened a couple of years ago, immediately they started to put together programs for Black and brown folks, and I thought that was fantastic. What didn't happen was that LGBTQ people were not included as a disenfranchised community, right? So when I went to bat to fight for some of those inclusions, they would say, well, send us your Black and brown gay people, right? And I was like, but I think what we're not understanding here is that it isn't just the Black and brown gay people that get discriminated against. It's also members of our community that are not Black and brown that get discriminated against. And they're like, well, we're worrying about Black and brown. And I see why that's important. In general, in the big screen, the Black and brown community has been most despaired. And it has been at the hands of the white community, right? Like people keep saying, oh, we need to fix the system. And I keep saying, no, the system's working just fine. The system is doing what the system was intended to do. And that was to keep white people and white-owned businesses and white superiors at the top and keep the rest of us down, right? So we don't have to change this. We don't have to fix the system. We have to change the system so that it does something different, right? And I think that that I was very caught off guard that LGBTQ inclusion was not a part of some of the pieces that came along. So we had to build our own. We had to call friends at banks and say, hey, build a program from LGBTQ people. We had to go to friends at foundations and say, hey, give us money to give to LGBT-owned businesses that don't fall in these other categories. So from a COVID perspective, I think one of the things painfully that I learned was that even within the group of despaired, the LGBT community gets left out. And then the other thing I learned that was really heart touching was that in the LGBT community, we are a family. We do show up for each other. And that has happened by many of our members who are small businesses that have been suffering. They would call and say, listen, I just lost my whole, month of work, but is there somebody I can help with the website? Is there somebody I can help with, marketing? Is there some? So the community, for me, felt like it really did come together as a family in some ways. And even in having some of the hard conversations around our own transphobia within our LGBTQ community, to have those conversations and to say, damn, like I am off on that one. Like, let me get educated, let me participate. And I think, if anything good could come out of a pandemic, I think it has been some of that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's, again, so good to hear about your work. And I want to open up a couple of questions to all the panelists. So affordable housing is incredibly necessary and incredibly scarce in the city of Boston and surrounding areas. What are some policies or programs which would particularly improve the well-being of trans community members that might address the housing crisis in the city that you might draw our attention to? So does any panelist want to jump in there?
I mean, I can jump in from the housing scarcity. It's a big problem, right? And it has a lot to do with zoning. It has a lot to do with people not being able to afford housing in some of the places. Gentrification is alive and well and thriving through COVID and through this housing time. I think it's a unified housing effort that has to be done with the legislature, and the corporate sector has to get involved. I think the corporate sector has to get involved to say, hey, we're going to have housing programs for some of our folks that are not able to put down a down payment. I mean, in a traditional housing, to purchase a home, it's a 20% down payment on a house that would say $500,000. Who keeps $100,000 lying around? I mean, that's just a hard first piece. But also, how do you work with some non-traditional housing pieces, push the legislator to change some of these zonings perspectives, and work with organizations like CHAPA, like others that can actually, I think the whole community has to come together and advocate for an incrementalist policy. And a lot of it has to do with zoning laws. I mean, in Brookline, you can't build a house that doesn't sit on a half of acre, and it has to be a single family house, right? So why can't you build a high rise with 50 units? It's not allowed. It's based on the zoning, because people don't want renters in their community going to their schools, playing in their yards, playing in their parks.
It's very unfortunate and definitely is a struggle. And I hear you on the zoning. Where I'm from in Newton, we're having a lot of zoning discussions just about that, about, multi-unit housing, and personally very much hoping that we can structure zoning to encourage more affordable housing, more units, and love to see more renters accessing our different communities. Does anyone else have any suggestions for how we might address affordable housing in the city of Boston and surround?
I'll jump in here, real quick.
Yeah, jump in,
some background. I actually am from the Philadelphia area, and so have spent a lot of time working in Philadelphia politics and Pennsylvania politics. And the recent change in the conversation around gentrification in Philadelphia, which I am sure every city across the country is facing at this point in time, is that there was a 10-year tax abatement where the city basically said, if you build new construction in the city of Philadelphia, you get your first 10 years of property taxes wiped off. You're good, you're clean, you don't have to pay those 10 years. Led to a boom of gentrification, construction and building, wiped out affordable housing in the city, and made it really hard for neighbors to stay in their neighborhoods long term. What the city council recently did in Philadelphia, which is something that we could do in a new administration under Mayor Wu very easily in Boston, is take the example out of Philadelphia, where they now impose a 1% construction tax on all new property and all abated renovations to properties. And the profits that they are making from that construction tax are now going into building new affordable homes for members of the Philadelphia community at large. There are other considerations to take into effect, as Grace has pointed out, that are very specific to the LGBTQ and specifically the trans community, that we have to prioritize when we're talking about housing and employment and access. But the ability for us to take something like gentrification and the rapid change of our neighborhoods and use that as a funneling tool to build out more affordable housing in these communities is something that we could do and have the power and capabilities to do. It's being done elsewhere.
That is so fascinating and wonderful to hear about. Thank you so much, Michael. So a last question for the panelists, and then we'll squeeze in questions from the audience if we have time, are if there are any opportunities that any of you would like to share with folks watching that may lead to some actionable steps for improving economic security for the LGBTQ community. So any policies, events, programs, or organizations that you all want to shine a light on or draw our attention to, please shout it out.
A quick plug, buy gay, okay? Buy gay. When I got this job, I made an assessment of how, we spend $10,000 a year between electricians and yard people and snow people and all those people at our house, right? And none of them were gay. None of them were LGBTQ. So we have made an effort, my wife and I, to start to shift our spending to LGBTQ owned businesses. And you can go to our website and there's a list of all our small businesses, but we buy our coffee from Kiko's Coffee. He's a gay coffee seller.
Roaster.
Grocer. We buy our, wine and cheese from a place in the South End that's gay. We just had our house smarted up from Level Up, who's a gay, person who does that. So if we take the economy that we spend, the amount of money that we as a collective spend, and we spend some of it in the LGBTQ community, you're helping increase the revenue of the small business economy. And the other thing is hire gay, hire LGBTQ, because you're really going to get a different perspective. And from a business view, you need to know what the LGBTQ non-binary community is doing, because our kids are going to be the majority of that community in the next 15 or 20 years. And we need to be ready for that market. So you need to hire those employees so that they become a part of the culture, so that you're competitive in 15 to 20 years when the majority of the people are going to identify in a different way than we identify now, and definitely a different way than we identified 30 years ago.
Thank you, Grace. Other panelists want to shout out any opportunities? Michael.
I do, but I've also spoken a lot too. I want to see if Trey Andre has anything to.
Oh, Trey Andre, you did unmute. Go for it, Trey Andre.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Michael. One of the things that MTPC is working on is actually developing a leadership and professional development academy for our community members, because trans people, we can face up to 5 times the rate of unemployment that our cisgender counterparts face, right? And then it's about that investment. If you think about it's almost like there's the trajectory of a trans person very often can follow that school to prison pipeline. We're trying to interrupt that. And if they don't have, what we want to do is to really build up their skills, their knowledge, their experience, and it be actually developed by our community. So community is actually going to help develop this curriculum for this academy. And then once we pilot it with our community members, we're looking for about 10 community members to pilot this with. What we're planning on doing is actually providing financial stipend for them monthly while they are working on developing their skills and becoming that those employers want to hire, right? So we're working on developing this academy. We're very excited about this, and also we need money in order to do this. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a targeted campaign to really fundraise for this academy.
That's awesome. Well, I'll be looking out for how to, contribute and participate, because that sounds like an amazing opportunity to lift up trans folk. Michael, you waited so patiently. Want to jump in?
Absolutely, thank you. First, I just want to shout out Ellen in the chat, asked if there were other LGBTQ plus training institutes for queer individuals to run for political office. I would highly recommend, Ellen, that you check out the Victory Institute. It is a national organization that does exactly that. Very great, a lot of wonderful coming out of that program. The second thing that I would like to add is that the state is in a very unique fiscal situation right now. That is wonderful for our community if we know how to organize and take advantage of that. We have a budget surplus of, I think it was $2 billion, am I right? $2 to $3 billion, it was significant. And we received about $5 billion, $6 billion in ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funds. So altogether, we're looking at anywhere from $7 to $8 billion in budget surplus of just extra money that we could be using in a way to benefit the LGBTQ plus community. I, like our organization, Break Time, is specifically targeting this to go to some of these funds to go to the Youth Works line item, which provides summer and year-round employment opportunities for young adults. If we're really talking about ensuring that we are preparing our next generation of the workforce, the Youth Works line item is key to this. And so the first round of ARPA funds are really about to wrap up. They literally could wrap up any minute now as we're speaking, because the conference committee is meeting as we speak. But there will be a second round that should come out sometime in January, and your advocacy around how those funds are spent is going to be so key and critical. So if you see a public testimony opportunity, if you see an opportunity to attend a town hall, we really need people to be there to talk about how these funds can and should be directed towards things like, again, job training for young adults, specifically young adults of color and LGBTQ plus young adults, individuals returning to the workforce, whether that's from some sort of institution or other, and really talking also about conversations about upskilling the existing workforce to get access to better jobs as well. So very key piece of work that we could be pursuing right now.
Well, thank you so much for that, Michael. And Shaitia, I hope you don't mind if I jump in and plug our commission hearing for tomorrow. The Mass Commission on the Status of Women is holding a hearing on women in the workforce. Of course, our statutory imperative is to collect data and report on the status of women, but we really welcome all participants at our public hearing. It's a virtual public hearing, and we just dropped in the chat a registration link to the Zoom hearing. And we also have a survey where we're collecting data on what folks are interested in, what issues they're facing and what they need as to their participation in the workforce. So again, our commission is focused on women, but we do want to hear from everybody. So please consider attending our hearing, however you have your gender identity, and please respond to our survey and other opportunities for folks to collect testimony and contribute their voices to how funds should be allocated or how policy should be developed. Definitely, we should all keep our eyes open, and for folks who have opportunities they're aware of, please shout it out in the chat, or if a panelist has other ideas, please name them now. I just want to give an opportunity to Lee to say any opportunities, and then I'll turn it back over to Shaitia as we close.
Hi, thanks. I just threw a few things in the chat. One is, I think these programs that we've heard about are amazing. And I think one way to help raise their visibility and expand resources might be to study them and show how effective they've been and how crucial they are at raising, increasing opportunities, especially for people who are at the low opportunity end of our community. So let's talk.
Thank you, Lee. And Shaitia, thank you so much for this panel. Please close us out.
I did have one question that wasn't addressed in the last question that I just wanted to ask, and it was specifically for Treandre. And we had a viewer ask, do opportunities for growth and movement in the organization look different for trans folks than they do for cis folks?
I mean, I think it's both yes and no. Because one, it is, when we're talking about advancement in terms of, in your career as a trans person, one really is about having the opportunity, the equal opportunity, right? But it's not only having the equal opportunity, because someone could have the equal opportunity, but they may not have, because of a lack of investment, because they may not have had the same access to resources, that they actually maybe, even though the opportunity is there, they are at a disadvantaged place because they have not had the same resources. So it's the access, making sure that people have the access to the same, the resources, but the resources do have to be tailored to a trans person, right? It's not a one size fits all. So it does have to be tailored, but I think it's about making sure that but that person is in a place to really be able to be developed and to be pushed forward.
Thank you for sharing. And thank you to all of our panelists. There was a lot of useful information. I think tips for folks that might be in manager positions or, business leaders, folks from different elements of our community. So thank you so much for sharing just a little bit about all of the work that you all do and some ideas for strategizing moving forward. I'm just so grateful for everybody to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Treandre. Thank you to our participants on Zoom and Facebook. All this information we're going to try to capture and put into a follow-up email. So if you have registered, you'll get that tomorrow. Even if folks haven't registered, there will be a recording on our YouTube and our Facebook pages. So feel free to share and send to your friends. And we hope to see you next time. And December 16th is our next event. And yeah, have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.